Welcome to this week's episode of the Inside Kingston podcast, where experienced professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders based in Kingston upon Thames are invited on to share their story with us. I'm your host, Amir Rocha Lima.
This week's episode of the Inside Kingston podcast is brought to you by Holland Harnham Wills, a financial planning and wealth management firm based in Kingston upon Thames. Holland Harnham Wills specialises in retirement planning for senior professionals and successful business owners. Visit hhw-uk.com to start feeling more relaxed and confident about your financial future.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. I'm joined today by Jon Tolley. Jon is the co-owner of Banquet Records, an independent record store here in Kingston. Jon is somewhat of a local celebrity in Kingston, famed for bringing the likes of Mumford & Sons, the 1975, and Shawn Mendes to town. Jon grew up in the area and started working at Banquet Records after university. He bought the store with his business partners 13 years ago. Banquet Records' continuing success, when other record shops are closing down at an alarming rate, stems from their multifaceted approach to the business, which I'm sure other independent retailers could learn a lot from. So whether you're interested in the music business or would like to know more about a successful independent retail store in general, then I hope you enjoy this episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Welcome, Jon Tolley, to the Inside Kingston podcast. So I am really excited about this conversation for many reasons, but in particular because, one, I'm a big music fan, but I'm also quite interested in business. And I'm keen to get your opinion on certain things where business and music sort of cross in a Venn diagram.
Yeah.
But to kick off, I wouldn't mind going a little bit more back in time, if that's okay. So you're a local lad? You grew up around Kingston?
Yeah, that's right. So I grew up in Chessington, went to school in Kingston, went to university for a few years and then came back to Kingston. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I got a part-time job at a record shop and then never left. So here, decades later.
Absolutely. And what was the music like in Kingston or this area when you were growing up?
I mean, there was always stuff here. It's really hard, and like listeners might, some younger listeners might not be able to relate to this in the same way, but it's really hard to get across how life was before everyone had the internet in their pocket. And so music at that time was a lot more based, you found out about stuff way more from printed media and from word of mouth. And the record shop at that point was a real hub of being able to find out about new things. I think that the role of the record shop has probably changed in since then. But at that point, there was this cool little weird record shop in Kingston, which was telling me about bands I hadn't heard of before, putting on bands that I hadn't heard of before, but the guy behind the counter said it was cool, so I would check it out. I think Kingston has always punched above its weight musically, but it's probably sort of accelerated in the last few years.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Jon, do you remember the first album you ever bought, or the first album you were given, if you were too young to even buy an album?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I really started discovering music as a kind of subculture as opposed to what my sister's hand-me-downs were, was around the Blur Modern Life is Rubbish album.
Amazing album.
I think I probably got into music a little bit later than some, probably just as I was going into sixth form, becoming a young adult, as opposed to just kicking a ball around as my hobby, which was what it was up until then. So yeah, and I think that's the point. So everyone remembers their first record. Nobody really remembers their first stream. And I think that's the point we'll probably come on to about physical music and why it's important. And
definitely, we'll go on to that. Just before we do so, first gig that you remember going to?
So yeah, I mean, it was really Blur who sort of kind of changed my life. So I went to like local gigs at Heatham House and the Grey Horse, but they were just sort of local bands as opposed to kind of concerts. Yeah. So the first gig that really sort of blew me away was Blur on that Sugary Tea tour.
Fantastic.
And that is something which kind of then I realised there was this thing where like songs that you didn't hear on the radio but still everyone knew every word of it, and this kind of whole different world, and it was exciting, and I wanted to know more and more about it. So it was that band who got me into an indie subculture, and then I realised that there was like a punk rock world, and then I realised there was a UK punk rock world, and they were probably years between each other discovering that. Yeah. But again, it was at a time when you couldn't just Google it. Yeah. You had to really kind of investigate.
So this brings me on to a point that I wanted to explore with you further, because it seems to me that a lot about understanding and being able to enjoy different genres of music lies in the context behind it and the context behind creating it. How would you suggest somebody goes about building their musical vocabulary, for the lack of a better term, or building the context behind different genres, so they can go from what the Sisters' hand-me-downs into Blur and into something even more specific?
Well, I mean, there's loads related to that. First off, talk about those relationships. I think the other relationships that I've seen and probably was influenced by was the power of the record label, and what labels had a sound or a culture around them, and at that point it was discovering new bands from that, and also new bands from bands who have toured with other bands. So if said band decides to take another band out on tour, then it's got their seal of approval, and then you can check out all their work and all this stuff. That was one thing. I can't remember where we got to. About sort of discovering more and more. I mean, I think music, for me, music without context, it's objective, and in context it becomes subjective. So you have feelings and emotions when you put it into context. You remember that song. I was dating that person. You remember that other song. That was the time that my football team did this. It's emotions, and that's why we don't know what's going to happen in the future, like with AI and with global warming and climate change and all this stuff. But we do know that people will always need music because there'll always be an emotional connection. It's an art. It's not a science. So you can go down whatever tangent you go down because it's everyone's individual story and journey, and I believe in that. And what you're talking about there with Jay-Z, so I think that punk is a lifestyle as opposed to music, and I think that if you look at Public Enemy, for example, that probably one of the most punk bands. What a message! Like what they're trying to deliver is it's poetry, and it's clever, and it's getting a message out there. And I think that's why I sort of fell in love with punk rock, because bands like, say, Propaganda and Shelter were talking about veganism and gay rights and Buddhism even, which it's not for everyone, but you could well, gay rights should be for everyone, but it's not. Some of the messages are something you relate to very well, some of them less so, but when you hear a message through music, it's a lot. It connects, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And so and I love that. So the whole point about within context is something that I always feel. Yeah. And having, so Jamie Cullen, for example, who played for us at the weekend, before the gig, I thought he was just like a talented pianist, and I didn't really know much about him. I went to that gig, and it was incredible. And I have a completely different feeling towards Jamie Cullen now than I did previously, and like just allowing yourself to be in an environment to be exposed to things is really rewarding.
So this brings me on to some of the activities that Banquet Records does in terms of engaging artists with the community, be it the Banquet Records community of customers, or actually the Kingston community as a whole. So there's 2 points here that I wanted to ask about. Firstly, you've mentioned it already, in the age of streaming, Spotify, and algorithms deciding what we might like next, when a person like me, an average Joe, walks into an independent record store, I think I still know how to navigate it because I'm from an era before the internet. But how would you suggest some of our younger listeners actually navigate a record shop? When they open the door, they see rows of vinyl and posters and cool-looking staff. What should they do, or how should they sort of behave to get the most out of that environment?
Well, I guess the difference in 2019 as opposed to 1999 is that kids today are fully up to speed way more than they were able to be back then. They know the tunes more than we do, they know the artists, and sometimes our role is to facilitate their purchase or their behaviours rather than to sort of lead them. Now, obviously, we have a preference to some of the things that we think are important, bands that we love, bands that we might need to give a bit of an extra nudge to. but you'll find that the customer nowadays is way more clued up. So we need to offer the customer something which they can't get elsewhere, and that might be like price does come into it, but price isn't the driver for what we do. It's all about exclusive releases, about signed copies of records, about in-store performances or ways to meet the band or watch the band live in Kingston. And you introduced this piece by talking about how you're a music fan and a business person, and I think that's key to it as well. I think that sometimes, this is probably going a bit deeper than the question was supposed to go, but I think that sometimes the market can deliver social good in a way that it isn't always recognised. So some of the things that we do are about the community, and it's not just about a geographical community. It's about the music community and other things that link people together. I've gone completely rambling.
No, you haven't, because actually that speaks really loudly to part of what we're trying to do with this podcast, which is to strengthen the business community in and around Kingston upon Thames. Because
I think that sometimes government, and obviously I'm a councillor in Kingston, so I see things in a different way as well, but sometimes a top-down approach won't ever work on the arts. I mean, obviously governments and authorities have roles to help facilitate the arts, but the stuff is going on already, and so we should be able to help that happen rather than get in its way. And you don't want loads of old people in an office deciding what's cool for the young people.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? The kids will know, the young people will know, and they just need to be able to do those things in a safe environment. And so obviously there's legislation which needs to happen to look after people, but at the point where we dictate what consumer taste should be is not the kind of society that I think we should have.
Absolutely. So that says to me that even though you're a co-owner here of the record store, and of course you guys are linked to promoting gigs locally as well, you've got your own record label, but still it seems to me that you can't be that guy if you don't spend time on the shop floor.
Yeah, and Mike and myself, we every day we're at work, we're on the shop floor. We don't spend all day on the shop floor, but we are on the shop floor every day. It's important to understand what the behaviour is, what to get on top of new trends before get ahead of the curve, and just to pick up on taste and changing demand, because people often talk to us about what our 5-year plan is or what have you, and we don't really have one, because for 2 decades all we've been doing is watching what other people have decided is the future and allowing and facilitating that, with obviously a sort of steer towards some of the things that we think are important.
And for me, that also speaks loudly to something else that you guys do, and I think this is a company culture thing, which I would like to think that in my own business we share the same ethos, which is this. You just don't sit around and wait for the customers to come along. And as an independent retailer, that is really important, given that you have all these big national brands trying to eat a slice of your cake. So tell me a little bit about that, but in particular, how you guys seem to have found a lot of success in marrying the customer's purchase of a physical album to the customer's desire to want to see that person perform live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. I was working at the shop as it was about to go bust. We ran out of money, we ran out of stock because we didn't have money to buy stock with, so we have it quieter and quieter. I've seen it at its worst. And so it was possibly that which meant we had to create and innovate to have a reason to bring people into the shop. Why should they come to us? Like, if you can buy a CD off, I mean, it probably wasn't even Amazon back then, but if you can buy a CD at a supermarket or HMV cheaper than you can buy it from us, what's the reason to come to us? Although nowadays we do compete on price as well, but there's other things, and it's about service and it's about product rather than it being about a race to the bottom, because no one wins in the race to the bottom. We're not about algorithms, we're about spotting things and making our personal changes based on what we see. And there's some things we spot as a trend which we wouldn't be behind as much, and we don't want to be a part of that.
So just focusing on this aspect of being an independent retailer in a sector that of course has big national brands competing against you, it seems to me that in the independent music retailer world in particular, you guys behind the scenes consider yourselves more allies than rivals. Would that be a fair assessment from an outsider?
Yeah, both morally and actually pragmatically, we do need other shops to continue. So I think the benefit of the good thing when you go into if you come to our shop, or if you go into Resident, if you go into Rough Trade, you go into other stores, is that we're all different, and you can find different product, different service, and different kind of ideas, and a different atmosphere. So we're not competing with those people. But if you look at something like H&V, which has obviously been in trouble recently, whilst we do compete with them, we do need them to exist as well. If there isn't a high street chain selling music, there's a worry that artists like, say, Adele and Ed Sheeran might decide, I'll tell you what, we'll just put all our stuff exclusively to Amazon, and we won't bother with the independent record shops. And obviously, maybe we can cope without 50 Ed Sheeran albums or 50 Adele albums, maybe. But if it's 50 of those and 50 of those and 50 of those, then it all adds up. Or worse still, artists might be like, I'll tell you what, physical music's dead because there's no high street stores doing it. And I don't think it is, for all those reasons that we sort of hinted on earlier about it being works of art. It's your art collection, your record collection. You have that emotional connection to a physical release in a way that you don't to a stream. And I think that people will always have a place for physical music. Maybe less than it used to be. Yeah. But the pie is big enough.
Absolutely.
For us all to slice.
And with that in mind, I wouldn't mind hearing from you a little bit about Record Store Day, which is a movement that happens across the country. In fact, it happens across the world, I believe, in different times, probably. Yeah. But that, if nothing else, has got a lot more people interested in their local independent record shop again. So how was Record Store Day for you this year?
So again, putting it into context, Record Store Day was created as a kind of a reason to drive people back into record shops at a time, probably 12, 13 years ago now, where record shops were struggling. Why aren't people shopping with us? The internet is killing the physical music industry, and all this kind of thing. So there was ideas of let's have an event to drive people into record shops, and it started off with a kind of putting on bands and having a party and a few re-releases and what have you. But a decade later, it's turned into a day which has hundreds of physical releases coming out only from independent record shops, so you can't get them at Amazon, you can't get them at Tesco or Sainsbury. And it's first come, first serve, you can't buy them online, so people have to queue up to go into their record shop. So there's two benefits there. One is the immediate cash injection. It's easily our busiest day of the year, hands down. But also it means people have to come to the shop. You have to queue up. Not everything is immediate. Sometimes you have to put a bit of effort in to get the thing you want. People come into the store, and what we particularly try and do is make sure it's not a click and collect. Like, we're not trying to be Argos. Yeah. So we make people come to the store, and then they have to browse. They have to have the experience of buying a record in a record shop. So that's really important, and we find that the relationship is then sometimes it's created or sometimes it's enhanced, but the actual experience of going into the record shop and seeing, oh, actually, I've enjoyed this. They come again a month later or a week later. It's really important. So yeah, it's a busy time of year for us. The weekend, the week of Record Store Day is probably worth 2 months' trade.
Wow. Okay.
And it's really full on. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun, and it's another excuse to talk about record shops.
Yeah.
So the national media and the local media gives us a reason to remind people that we're still here.
So with the sort of Record Store Day initiative happening around the country, and also your own business savviness, it's mixing those two and then engaging with the local community. That means that you, as an independent retailer, forget that you're in the music sector for a second, can actually have a thriving business, right?
Yeah, and I think Banquet tries to understand what the customer or the supplier wants. I think that's our main thing. So we're very much trying to work out what this touring band, do they want a lot of money, or do they want a lot of album sales, or do they want just something cool? And so it's trying to figure out what of those the band is particularly after, and then creating an event which will please the band, and then that event pleasing the band means the band comes to Kingston, which brings the customers to us.
Yeah.
And so events which wouldn't have existed without us. I mean, it's just facts that these bands wouldn't be visiting Kingston unless we were doing them. They happen. So yes, there's a business sense to that, but it's really driven by trying to understand what is best for the music fan, be that the band or the punter, because we're all music.
Absolutely. It seems to me, though, that this wouldn't be possible if you guys didn't have a good understanding about the business between you and the artist you're trying to bring into Kingston. So, I'm thinking of some of the gigs that you've managed to bring into your shop. I'm guessing those people are not saying yes to anyone else that's inviting them. So tell me a little bit about how you marry, I guess, your knowledge of the music industry with creating an event that the artist, as well as the punter, is going, you know what, this all makes sense for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that people don't necessarily appreciate immediately is that before we'd taken over ownership of the shop, we were already putting on gigs. So they were a lot more small scale and typically at the Pill or at Bacchus, like smaller venues. But we understood the actual mechanic of putting on a gig, booking a sound guy, making sure people are safe, how you do the ticketing and all of this stuff. So we were doing that, and then when we started getting bands passing through who were trying to sell records or play in stores, that's a similar concept. So we hit the ground running on those, have smaller gigs with about maybe 50 people, 100 people. Then you scale it up a bit, And bearing in mind, a lot of this was a quarter of a century ago. So this week, Jamie Cullum and Bastille and Richard Hawley and Divine Comedy and Skepta have all played Kingston. But it wasn't like we just created a business and decided to ask these people.
Absolutely.
It's been done on experience and also on relationships. So if you talk about those bands that I just mentioned there, Jamie Cullum was new to us, but Bastille we'd put on first time was probably 7 years ago.
Okay.
It's worth 150 people came. At that time, that wasn't a failure. That was just the level that Bastille was at.
Great band, by the way.
I love them, and I love that gig. But so we have that relationship. So when we reach out to them in 7 years' time, they know who we are. They know that we're not going to let them down.
Yeah.
And that's also the same with Skepta, which is obviously from a completely different world, completely different culture, the grime world. But we put on JME as an artist 3 years ago, and Skepta turned up and actually performed when no one was even expecting that to happen.
Yeah.
So it's about relationships and understanding it, and I think that you're right to say there that they wouldn't just say yes to everyone. So what's the reason they say yes to us? It's because we understand what they want, we understand what the customer wants, and also we've got a kind of a seal of approval that if it's coming from us, we won't mess it up. And I think that other shops and other businesses will have that same thing too.
So in your own world, in the music sector, in the independent record shop sector, you've built the context for that request to even be viable for the artist to consider, right? This is for me a lesson that can be applied to any other sector within the independent retail space.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do the work, and you'll lose some money at sometimes and whatever. But the people who need you most, do that job bloody well. Do it with a smile. Do it professionally. That gets remembered. I mean, it was as an example, Mumford and Sons, who are like a world famous arena band now. We had originally booked them for an in-store 10 years ago.
Wow.
And Marcus had a bad voice, and so they pulled out. They're like, no, we'll come back. And it was actually, they did come back.
They did.
And we honoured those tickets to people who still had their tickets from 10 years ago when they came in. But it's about making the effort and doing everything as pro as you can. Like if you're going to spend your time at work, don't be clock watching. Give it your all.
Yeah.
And the team we have at Banquet are all with that mindset, and that's why they get the job. And I can't remember ever really studying a CV. It's like getting a feel for someone's attitude.
Yeah.
And you'll see. I mean, as we've been talking here, there's been people coming and going, but
Yeah.
people are constantly working because there's so much to do. But you get the most out of it when you put the most in.
Absolutely. The phrase we use in my firm when we talk to clients who are planning their retirement is, life's not a rehearsal. So get busy living, or at least planning the life you want to live. So we're definitely kindred spirits there. I wouldn't mind getting your thoughts, John, on Banquet Records as part of the Kingston community. And in particular, how do you guys engage with the local community, not only to put on great gigs and have this cool independent retail store, but also to raise awareness for issues that, as a firm, is important to your own culture?
Yeah, I mean, community is really important. So the music community is one kind of community, but also the geographic community. We started putting on gigs in Kingston because we want bands to come to us, not necessarily, we don't have to go to London to do it. I love this place. I've got no intention to move away. my route into local politics was very much based on like protecting music venues in Kingston. When now I'm a councillor, you see things that as a quite privileged person male who's in good health, I'm being exposed to things that I wasn't aware of, and that opens your eyes to things. And we have this platform, as you've rightly recognised, which enables us to get a message out to people a bit easier. So it's not just about fundraisers, of which we do a few, but it's about educating people to look at this homelessness problem, look at this issue about climate change and recycling. How can we get involved in that? So yeah, we do have a platform. I'm aware of that and the responsibility that we have to use it in a good way. And there's other things we can do as well. Like we facilitate Kingston Carnival, which is a great music event run by K-Rec, which is a race equalities group. There's not much more fun you can do than watching music and trying to fight racism.
Absolutely.
And then there's various issues that we can do on a sort of on a political level without it being like party politics. On a kind of trying to change people's attitudes and educate people.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like a weird thing to be involved in politics, because the identity of Kingston and trying to make the town better is something that's been driving us for ages. It's just I didn't realise that council was a way of doing that until recently.
So that's interesting, because it is, again, it speaks volumes to this ground up approach that you and Banquet Records seem to take as a company culture, almost like a motto. You start from what is actually happening, and then building the business, building the gigs, building the different activities to match that and try to enhance or lead that into a better direction. Yeah. So without getting political, because this is not the point of the show, but I think it's interesting for our listeners to know, obviously you're a councillor with the Liberal Democrats. Tell me a little bit about your work in this capacity. Because I think a lot of people might not even know what a councillor gets up to.
Yeah, I didn't when I became one. so it was quite a kind of culture shock. My whole thing was about Kingston Carnival got cancelled one year for no good reason. And I still, to this day, don't think there was a good reason. My view at that point, and remains the case, is that the decision makers at council don't have all the information with which to make a good assessment of the situation, and sometimes they get decisions wrong. So what I want to be is the messenger from this group of people to these decision makers over there. Kingston Carnival got going the next year, in part because we were able to explain that the worries they had about safety were unfounded, and winning the argument. So within politics, I always talk about winning the argument, not the fights. And there's a lot of easy fights you can have with people, but to make a change, you have to convince people, give them an evidence, and with that, you can make a better decision about not only Kingston Carnival, which is obviously my route in, but about the cycling infrastructure, whether or not we should have a public water fountain in the town centre, what we're doing with council housing and stuff like this. It's all about, that is the same things that we've just been talking about. It's about community, and it's about making your place better. And obviously you've mentioned my party there, but I think it's everyone who is involved is trying to make their community better. And we might have different views on the right way of doing that, but it's quite inspiring to see a lot of motivated people to do that. We recently took over the council a year ago, and that's been a very strange and hard to keep up with cultural shift, because it's quite fun when you're opposition, because you get to moan about things and try to change bits here and there, but when you're actually in charge of running it, it's a really tough job. And yes, mistakes get made, but I think generally the idea that you're trying to contribute towards making your hometown and your home borough a better place is quite rewarding. Yeah,
that's fantastic, and that's a great spirit to have, to be in that position that you're in with the team behind you as well there.
But so we mentioned this and the politics, and it harks back to a question that you had previously, but I think Banquet has this platform, and we've got a good social media reach, and we employ a graphic designer, and we have a videographer, so we can make good examples of what we've been doing, but we're quite a visible version of what we do, but there's a lot of other people who do what we do as well. So if you look at Bacchus, or the Fighting Cocks, as like venues, they are reaching out and they are putting on events for underprivileged groups, and they are trying to create things which wouldn't otherwise exist. If you look at Andy at Natjack's, who's been trading in Kingston for 28 years, he's got 5 stores now, and gives to that local scene. And I think that you might get this theme as you do this series, but I think the thing about independent stores and independent businesses is that we're not on a career path, we're not on a career ladder. So I've got no desire to build up Banquet and then go and take over Rough Trade and then go and take over H&V and then try and have a piece of Amazon. Like this is what I do, and this is going to be what I do until I retire or the business folds.
That's exactly what I think people are looking for today, given the world driven by algorithms that we have. So in other words, if I may very crudely sum up what you've beautifully said there, to get the Banquet experience, you have to come over to Banquet.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have to be here and actually get a feel for the place, touch the place, and be better for it, really.
And we tried to make our website a version of that, and we tried to, the conversation that we would have over the counter, we tried to replicate with handwritten notes when you order a record online, but nothing that beats the actual physical thing.
Absolutely.
And we're going to see over the next 5-10 years a changing high street. I mean, you've read the same stories I have about these shops going bust and what's going to happen with the future of the high street. And as a council, we have to make some decisions on that as well. But I think the ones who've got a future are the independents, the ones who are offering something unique, which you can't get from that algorithm that you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and a brilliant lesson for us all to be mindful of as we think about our own businesses.
I think you just got to think about where your money goes. Whenever you buy something from an independent business, not only are you supporting that business who is providing the service that you obviously like, but also it's the fact that money will stay in the community. Whether or not it's because you put money into the till, which pays my wages, and then I go and get my lunch from Spuds. Yeah. But even on that very micro level, it's real, and you can see it there. But the amount of work that Max and Tom and Jane and Claire and Shibby and Mike and all the people that work for us, and obviously they get paid and it's their job, but that's never the driving force behind this. It's a feeling that you're creating something which wouldn't exist otherwise. Yeah. And it's a love of being involved in the thing of community and of putting on events which wouldn't have happened otherwise, and knowing that you're contributing. And just, again, it comes back to that thing that if you're going to work, then just do something that's worthwhile.
Okay, so as we wrap up, John, I'd like to ask you 3 quick-fire questions that our listeners are always interested in.
Okay.
And this, funnily enough, always goes back to this point of different people also being interested in opening up their own context and their own reference bank.
Yeah.
So, to kick off with, what do you do to relax outside of the office?
It's a tough one because I like not only music, but I like my business. I'm invested in it. I'm interested. Away from that, though, skateboard. I watched a terrible level of football, and I'm as addicted to the next Netflix series as everyone else.
Fantastic. Who do you admire and why?
Business-wise, or just in life?
In life.
I don't have any heroes. I admire people who are just trying to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, brilliant. So finally, the question is typically, what is your favourite book? But I will add to that, and I'll ask you about your favourite album as well, if I may. But let's start off with the first one. So what is your favourite book, or the book you've most gifted?
Do you know what? For all my talking about physical printed media and stuff, I'm not a big book person. So I will spend my time looking at records that I've fallen in love with.
Fantastic. So what is your favourite album?
This is a tough one, and you need a completely different podcast for this. I think the albums that are my favourite are the ones which have made changes in my life. So I think Blur Part Life is one, Face to Face Self-Titled is one, Cap Down Civil Disobedience is one. There's loads, but I'm always excited about the next thing. So right now, we're sitting in this room surrounded by boxes. I'm really excited about the Bastille album. What I've heard of it sounds brilliant, and it's a kind of concept record. By the time this podcast is out publicly, it'll be the next thing. And I think that's why I love going to work and I get up in the morning, because the next thing is always the most exciting.
That's brilliant. Finally, John, where can people find out more about you and Banquet Records?
So Banquet Records is everywhere on social media, at Banquet Records, and we're on banquetrecords.com. And for myself, you can come and talk to me in the shop if I'm not so busy. And there's a Twitter and a social media presence. But I definitely think that for the purpose of this podcast, you'd get everything you need from the Banquet
Fantastic.
site.
And we'll make sure we reference all of those links in the show notes. So, John, thank you for joining us here on the Inside Kingston podcast. It's been a pleasure getting to know your story.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
Thank you. That wraps up another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Make sure to check out our guests' website, pay them a visit, and help spread the word about what they're doing. If you have any questions or know someone who should be a guest on the show, please feel free to get in touch. I would also love it if you could go to iTunes and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We work hard to bring on some great guests, and getting a review from you is one way to help the podcast rate well on iTunes so that others can find and enjoy the show too. Thanks for listening.